This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Newly surfaced documents have revealed that a now-dead senior Republican strategist who specialized in gerrymandering was secretly behind the Trump administration's efforts to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. The New York Times broke the story last week in a story that called Thomas Hofeller the Michelangelo of gerrymandering. When Hofeller died last August, he left behind a computer hard drive full of his notes and records. His estranged daughter found among the documents a 2015 study that said adding the citizenship question to the census would, quote, be advantageous to Republicans and non-Hispanic whites and would clearly be a disadvantage to the Democrats, unquote. Census officials estimate 6.5 million people will not respond to the census if the citizenship question is added. This undercount could affect everything from the redrawing of congressional maps to the allocation of federal funding. In a court filing Thursday, plaintiffs challenging the citizenship question accused two Trump administration officials of falsely testifying under oath about the Justice Department's motivations for altering the census. The Supreme Court is also set to rule within weeks on whether Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross had the authority to add the citizenship question to the census. For more, we're joined by Ari Berman, senior writer at Mother Jones, a reporting fellow at the Nation Institute, author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. His new piece is headlined, Architect of GOP Gerrymandering Was Behind Trump's Census Citizenship Question. Ari Berman, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. So lay out this expose.
Good to see you again, Amy. So this is really startling smoking gun evidence in the census case that really undercuts why the Trump administration added this question. So the Trump administration added the citizenship question, and they claimed it was needed to better enforce the Voting Rights Act. Well, these new documents from Tom Hofeller show that it was not needed to enforce the Voting Rights Act. And in fact, the people that would be most harmed by the addition of the citizenship question, Latinos and other racial minorities, are the very groups the Voting Rights Act was designed to protect. And it clearly shows that this question was added to benefit the Republican Party, particularly white Republicans, because Tom Hofeller says in this unpublished study that is now key evidence in this case, this would be clearly a disadvantage to Democrats and an advantage to Republicans. So there you have it. I mean, this is really black and white. You can't get any more explicit than this. We now know for certain this is why the question was added to the census.
And talk about how we know this. Talk about Hofeller's estranged daughter.
Well, it's a pretty wild story. So there's a separate case in North Carolina challenging the gerrymandering of state legislative districts. Tom Hofeller has been the go-to expert in the Republican Party for decades on redistricting. And he's drawn some of the most extreme gerrymandered maps in places like North Carolina. And so there's a case challenging this map in North Carolina, and after Hofeller passed away, his daughter found hard drives with all of his work, and she gave it over to the plaintiffs challenging these gerrymandering.
Gave it to Common Cause.
Gave it to Common Cause and other plaintiffs challenging the gerrymandering in North Carolina. Now some of this evidence has now become public. There is more here too, by the way, Amy. We're going to learn more about the role that Tom Hofeller has played in gerrymandering efforts in other cases, but this pertains directly to the census case.
So the New York Times calls him the Michelangelo of gerrymandering. Talk about his whole history and also how this could have legal bearing and even going to the issue of the Supreme Court making a decision about Wilbur Ross adding the citizenship question in the census.
So Tom Hofeller is not a household name, but he's been an extremely influential person in the Republican Party for decades. He's basically been the Republican Party's go-to guy when it comes to redistricting. So he's traveled since the 1980s, state after state after state, drawn maps to boost Republican representation. And a lot of these maps, particularly after the 2010 election, have been struck down in court. So really gerrymandered maps he drew in places like North Carolina and Ohio have been invalidated by the courts. In fact, the North Carolina congressional map that Hofeller drew was invalidated by the Supreme Court in an opinion written by Clarence Thomas, who found that it was an unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. So even Clarence Thomas thought that the maps that Hofeller was drawing were too extreme. And the fact that you had the architect of GOP gerrymandering drawing up the census citizenship question is so startling, Amy, because the census forms the basis for redistricting. So we have to have unfair, inaccurate census data to be able to draw fair districts. If we have skewed census data, that's going to lead to skewed districts. So even before they start the gerrymandering itself, they're essentially gerrymandering the census to give themselves an advantage.
So in the 90s, Thomas Hofeller led the Republican effort to oppose using statistical sampling to gain a more accurate count of non-white populations that the Census Bureau tended to miss. At the time, Hofeller wrote, quote, "A census that uses sampling and statistical adjustment will be the biggest victory for big government liberalism since the enactment of the Great Society." I want to go to Hofeller speaking in 2001 at the National Conference of State Legislatures.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book on death and dying. Her 5 steps, I believe, can be applied to redistricting. And you can pick the people to whom they apply and the order in which they apply to those people. And those steps are, first is denial. It couldn't happen to me. The next step is bargaining. Maybe I can make a deal. The next step is anger. None of us have ever experienced that in the redistricting process. Next is depression. And finally, acceptance. So you might look at that. Maybe she'll write a new book on redistricting grieving.
That's Thomas Hofeller comparing redistricting to death. Ari Berman.
Well, I mean, it is funny because, I mean, redistricting has led to political deaths. If you think about what they're doing in places like North Carolina, they're trying to maximize Republican advantage. And basically, Hofeller is saying his goal with the census is to draw districts. This is a little technical, Amy, but his goal with the census is to draw districts basically only counting citizens. So for now and for decades, the way districts have been drawn is you count everybody. Everyone is entitled to representation, whether they are a voter or not, a citizen or not. What he's saying is we only want to draw districts counting citizens. What that means is that white Republicans will get a massive over advantage. They'll get a huge boost in representation, and minority areas where there are a lot of immigrants, they will receive less representation. So if the citizenship question is on the census, it will lead to a huge transfer of power to wider and more Republican areas. And Hofeller has stated that explicitly, and that's why the citizenship question was added to the census.
Ari, you write members of Trump's team may not have been fully forthcoming in their testimony under oath. Neither Trump transition team member Mark Newman nor John Gore, the former Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, who wrote the Justice Department letter, mentioned Hofeller's involvement in the letter when they were deposed under oath as part of a lawsuit by New York and 17 other states challenging the citizenship question.
Yeah, so the ACLU and other plaintiffs challenging the census citizenship question are trying to sanction these former Trump officials for lying under oath to conceal Tom Hofeller's involvement in this case. There's going to be a hearing in federal court in New York this week, and the big question is, will this make its way to the Supreme Court, and will it matter? I mean, this case is going to be ruled on in a matter of weeks. The justices have likely already written their opinions, so this is all very last minute, and this evidence really, really undercuts the Trump administration's claims of why they added this question. However, it still remains unclear whether this is going to have any impact on the Supreme Court itself.
So let's talk about gerrymandering and abortion.
So these issues are all connected. And when we saw all of these abortion bans, one thing that I realized is that many of the states passing these abortion bans recently also are very heavily gerrymandered. So you have, for example, in Ohio, which was one state that passed this abortion ban. Republican candidates in Ohio for the state house got 50% of votes in the last election, but control 63% of legislative seats. You look at Missouri, a Republican candidate in the Missouri House got 57% of the votes, but control 71% of the seats. So what's happening is that these Republican-controlled states, like Ohio and Missouri, they are more extreme because of gerrymandering. They are more red because of gerrymandering, and that leads to more extreme policies like these abortion bans. And it helps explain why Republican politicians are passing laws that even in their own states, people don't want. People don't want blanket bans on abortion, even in places like Missouri and Ohio. But we're seeing these laws pass because Republican politicians are insulating themselves from the will of the voters through gerrymandering.
I mean, this is a really important point. I mean, most Americans are pro-choice, and yet more than half the states have passed abortion restrictions. The state legislatures are anti-choice.
Exactly.
So explain further how gerrymandering leads to this.
So what happens is politicians get elected and they draw districts to maximize their impact and to try to give them as safe of seats as possible. And so they really feel like they are insulated from the will of the voters. They are in very safe districts. And so what's going on here is that they're not really concerned about the views of the public writ large because they feel like they only care about the voters in their districts. They're chiefly worried about a primary challenge. So politics is getting pushed further and further and further to the right. And so public opinion really isn't impacting the discussion of abortion in a lot of these cases. You also have in many of these states overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male legislators that are not affected by abortion the same ways. And many of the constituencies that are most harmed by gerrymandering, constituencies like women, younger people, people of color, they are also going to be most affected by these abortion bans.
And talk about Georgia in particular, the state that Stacey Abrams lost, that Brian Kemp won. Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State, so he was in charge of his own election when he ran for governor against Abrams, and how that plays out overall in politics, and particularly around abortion.
So voter suppression also explains why we have these extreme gerrymandering, these extreme abortion bans, because you look at Georgia, for example, where Brian Kemp was both Secretary of State and running for governor at the same time in 2018. He was essentially overseeing his own election. In that election, Georgia purged 2 million people from the voting rolls. They closed 214 polling places. 53,000 people had their registrations put on hold weeks before the election. All of this helped Brian Kemp and hurt Stacey Abrams and allowed Brian Kemp to eke out a very narrow victory over Stacey Abrams. And then he signed this abortion ban that Stacey Abrams was strongly opposed to, which was passed by a legislature in Georgia that was heavily gerrymandered in favor of Republicans. So you have an extremely gerrymandered Republican legislature, a governor who was elected in part of voter suppression, signing one of the most extreme abortion laws in the country. Had it not been for gerrymandering, had it not been for voter suppression, you might have had a very different legislature and a different governor in Georgia, and this would have been blocked or not have been passed in the first place.
So Hofeller's hard drives that his estranged daughters have now released. Talk about other effects that you can see coming out of this.
Well, it's really important because the next election is going to determine redistricting for the next decade. And in fact, the next census is going to form the basis for that redistricting in the next decade. And so right now, there's a lawsuit in North Carolina challenging these gerrymandered state maps. The question is, will the court strike down these maps before 2020? So there'll be a new North Carolina legislature. If there's a new North Carolina legislature, there will be a different election in 2020, and that will lead to different outcomes. And so we could be seeing Republican gerrymandering efforts unraveling in North Carolina, one of the most important swing states in the country. But more importantly, I think this just focuses attention on other issues. There's been so much focus on Trump, Amy, and everything that Trump is doing. But really, when it comes to state-level races, the gerrymandering at the local level and the census that forms the basis for redistricting, this has a huge outcome on politics for the next decade. And if Republicans are able to rig the census for the next decade, they will be able to rig so many important aspects of American politics as well.
Finally, what is happening in Florida? This is a separate issue, but the whole issue of reenfranchising what is called returning citizens, people who have served time in prison.
Florida passed a really historic ballot initiative in 2018 to restore voting rights to 1.4 million people with previous felony convictions. It was the largest expansion of voting rights in that state since the Voting Rights Act. Now the Florida legislature has passed a law dramatically scaling that back by saying that you have to pay all fines, fees, and restitution before you're eligible to vote. This is basically akin to a poll tax. People owe thousands, in some cases millions of dollars. There's one woman in Florida that owes $59 million for insurance fraud. And so if this law is signed by the governor of Florida, what it means is that people that thought they were in line to be able to vote, voters who thought they had passed this ballot initiative to reenfranchise people, instead now you're saying that people have to jump through serious financial hoops, even after they'd paid their debt to society, to be able to vote. This could affect hundreds of thousands of people, disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of people in Florida before the 2020 election.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Ari Berman, for joining us, senior writer at Mother Jones, reporting fellow at the Type Media Center, author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. We'll link to your piece in Mother Jones headlined, Architect of GOP Gerrymandering Was Behind Trump's Census Citizenship Question. When we come back, Clarence Thomas knows nothing of my work. Author Adam Cohen says the Supreme Court justice used his book to tie abortion to eugenics and got it wrong. Stay with us.